Betrayal violence is the conduct or the behavior of the person who's doing three things. Number one, they are maintaining a relationship with a committed partner. Number two, they are secretly and repeatedly violating fidelity. And number three, they are using deception, persuasion, and exploitation to avoid the consequences.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Betrayal Recovery Transformation Podcast, where we talk about all things betrayal, all things recovery, and all things transformation. I'm your host, Chris Rocha, here with my partner in healing and co-host, Jen Howie. Hi, Jen.
That was a nice one. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I can see on our little script this ... so I don't have any heads up as to what my introduction. I don't know why I said it like that. Anyway, I see the dots, and so I'm anticipating what is she going to say, and I realize I don't get to prep any comeback ever. But that was a kind intro. Partner in healing for sure.
Pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
we've done a lot of healing together. So
Yes, we have. Yeah.
Well, our guest today is Hope Ray. Hope is a therapist, and how do you pronounce that word, Hope?
Oh, I like to call myself a theoretician.
Theoretician.
Yeah,
Like a neurologist.
Ooh.
A theorologist is another way to say it, yeah. Because that's how my brain works. I only theorize about things, it seems. I like to zoom out, from the broader picture.
I love it. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have our first theorologist on the podcast today. This is a big deal. I didn't even realize what a big deal this was. Anyway, she is the creator of Getting Dire Straight program for men who have betrayed their partners with hidden porn use and other fidelity violating behavior. Hope is the creator of the gorgeous, may I add, Complex Partner Trauma magazine, which you can find on Amazon. And for over a decade, Hope has walked alongside betrayed partners and couples in her intensive-based practice in Michigan. Hope, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, I'm so grateful to be here. I'm glad to be with you. Looking forward to our discussion. Let's go.
Chris, out of curiosity, where did you find Hope?
Through the APSATS organization. On the listserv. Yeah, we were talking, podcast guests came up and Hope reached out, and I'm so glad she did because she is a dynamic powerhouse of a woman. And she is for helping men, and she's for the struggling spouse and the betrayed spouse, and she's a powerhouse.
You know where I found her?
Where?
TikTok.
Yes.
It's funny because Chris, you reached out to me. You're like, there's this dynamic woman I want to have on the podcast. I'm like, tell me about her. And you say who she is. And I'm like, why do I know that name? And I realized just the night before, no lie, just the night before, I had looked at every single one of her TikToks. I'm like, what are the chances that we both, encountered this woman sort of at the same time? So Hope, we are so glad that you're here. And clearly Chris and I spend our time doing different things. Mine's on TikTok.
Man,
and now here with you.
Me too, Jen. I'm right there with you. And so glad to know, that you spend all the time you do on there because, I don't know, it's fun. It's a blast, actually.
It's a great way to just get the little snippets you need to take you to the next thing, which is why we're here today, because we're talking about reality collapse. And what both Chris and I love about you is this tenacious spirit that you have, and what feels like I don't know, just this willingness to put things out there, to put the conversations out there, to say the hard things that everyone's really thinking and no one's really discussing. And when I say everyone, I mean mostly those who've experienced betrayal. So tell us a little bit, what is reality collapse, and how many times does it occur? What is this thing?
Well, reality collapse isn't controversial in and of itself. It's the word or the phrase that I use to explain what happens after betrayal when a person has sufficient information to understand the full picture of the endangerment their partner has put them in. And this doesn't mean they know all the secrets that their partner may still be keeping, or that they have all the information they actually need to really protect themselves, but they have sufficient information to experience this psychological shift point that says, whoa, I understand the depth and breadth of my partner's duplicity. I understand that I am woefully endangered, whether that's financially or having been physically exposed to something, or maybe it's emotional, and there's a lot of pain and betrayal, and it doesn't always have to be black eyes and bruises for it to be abuse, does it? When essential information about your own well-being and your own safety has been withheld from you, sometimes for years or decades, this is when we realize that we've been living in a constructed reality, and that is not only unfair, it's an injustice. And at that point, I find most partners do find a way to kind of cross the threshold into um, that reality collapsing, and them coming to the light of how very false that understanding of their relationship was. It's not their own fault. They've been deceived and maybe gaslighted, actually usually gaslighted, to get to this place. So, by no part of their own did they, sign up to be run through the mill like this or mistreated in this way. But reality collapse happens for most of us as partners, and it happens at different points. Sometimes it's a really overt kind of signature event that brings to the forefront the reality of how serious what you're dealing with is. Um, Other times it's kind of a slower growth or a slow build up to the point where you really kind of just flip on in your mind, wow, I am truly endangered in all these ways. I have been deeply impacted in all of these ways. So, there's a lot that happens after reality collapse. A lot of people talk to me about having experienced more than one. We can talk about that, but um, ultimately, it's not a controversial idea. It's just my way of explaining what happens when we have that kind of coming to moment, or that epiphany where uh, we essentially decide we are no longer willing to be treated that way, to tolerate any kind of behavior that wouldn't fall in line with our best interests. Not that we were even tolerating it before, we didn't know what was going on, but we draw a line in the sand usually at that point, and it's really where healing begins, because of one very simple fact, that until we understand how the extent of our endangerment, um, we can't really know all that needs to heal, right? And so it's usually the most painful kind of boiling point of all the trauma, but it's also a really important transition into the healing mentality, and the ability to move forward, where your life is no longer stuck because of what happened.
I have a couple thoughts that come to mind as you're describing or using the phrase reality collapse. One is this picture of standing on this wooden floor and the floor dropping out. And you find yourself in this basement. And actually, this ties into my second thought. I heard this podcast. There's a podcast out there called The Living Truth. It's a great podcast. And the host had a guest on that was talking about the secret basement. And the analogy he used was so validating to me. So you've pictured this family, there's a little boy and a little girl, and the mom and the dad, and a dog and a soccer ball, and the kids are playing in the backyard, and the mom's in the kitchen making cookies, and the dad's working in the garage, and the family is just like this normal white picket fence kind of situation. But at night, when the family goes to bed, he's been secretly getting up, and he's constructed this secret basement where he goes down and he does things that the family doesn't know about. So there's a secret porn addiction, there's infidelity happening, there's all these different forms of acting out, things that the wife and children have no idea about. And so when she finds out that there's this secret basement under their family home that's been there all the time and she had no idea, that sounds like reality collapse to me. The floor drops out. And then the point that was so validating is the struggling spouse or the addict, if he's an addict, will say, "Oh, I only went to the secret basement twice this month. Oh, it's such immeasurable." And it's like, no, no, that's horrible. It's not the number of times that the secret basement is visited, it's that it exists at all.
Yeah.
That's the pain point. So, my question for you, Hope, is how can we know if we've experienced reality collapse? Are there symptoms? Are there things to look out for? And also, is there a way to know that one's coming? Is there a way to brace for impact?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I haven't been asked that before, so we can explore that together. Let me just back up to the secret basement, which is one of Omar Minwalla's concepts. And it is so incredibly helpful for pretty much all the partners I've ever worked with, because it delineates that experience of having a whole separate life functioning within your home that you're not privy to, you're not given enough information about. So when it comes to reality collapse, I suppose it could be like what you said, Chris, the idea of, like the floor drops out and you kind of plummet into the basement. I haven't thought about it that way. But, ultimately what it is it's the third phase of what I call complex partner trauma. The idea of wanting to define this very specific experience for partners, no matter the gender, the idea of having experienced so much impact from the deception, the gaslighting, and the exploitative behavior of a partner who is withholding that information from them in order to avoid consequences. And let me just speak about the people who do that, by the way. I use this word betrayal violence, and I'm talking about people who, secretly and repeatedly cheat and then keep that information from their partner. When that happens, these folks very often are not trying to be abusive. I'm not trying to defend them. I'm just being real about the fact that these people don't recognize their behavior as anything sometimes but protective. Yes, protective of the self and perhaps protective of the partner. And so what happens then is this snowball effect of just growing, mounting secrets and lies, deception, betrayal. And for a person who's been betrayed by that, they've not only had their reality governed outside of their own consent, but they've also had a whole bunch of memories that have occurred that they need to reprocess. And so, what happens after reality collapse is that we begin to, I call it retroactive processing. We begin to go back through our memory banks and update the reality we now have more information about with the old one. And it's such an extremely painful hall of mirrors where, around every turn, with every trigger, with every moment of the day, there can be a new memory, a new picture, a new idea, a new thought to reprocess in light of the information that they now understand. And it's not necessarily that they understand more about the sexual behavior that occurred outside of their awareness. It might be that what they understand is just how bad the duplicity was, how willing their partner was to go, to what lengths their partner was willing to go to keep their secret life under wraps and to avoid consequences. And so, how do we know if we've had one of those? Well, if you know, because it's this experience where it's kind of a new dawn. I've had clients who've had very subtle awakenings into this place. Um, for instance, a client who was, getting her hair done, reading a magazine, and in one of the articles, she read about a person who had been cheated on, and somehow the resonance that occurred, within her soul by reading that article is where everything clicked for her. Now, that's kind of an atypical experience because she actually didn't know about any of the infidelity prior to that moment. But what's more typical is that women or men or anyone experiencing this journey of complex partner trauma, they will know about the secrets. They'll know about the hidden porn use. They'll know about this or that or the affair or whatever, but they don't know the whole picture. They know like the edge pieces of the puzzle. And so once you hit reality collapse, it's not necessarily that you get more pieces to the puzzle, it's that you stand back from the puzzle and you realize what kind of puzzle you're doing. It's an awful, betraying, deeply, you know, life-sucking and potentially, uh, well, life-altering, but potentially, deadly type of puzzle, depending on how long you want to interact with it in that particular form. So that's how you know you've had one, is that you've zoomed out and you're in that place of really understanding what you've been through, what the impact has been. This can happen more than once. I won't say too much more about that, but it does, it can. I remember when I had my own reality collapse in my first marriage, it kind of came for me in one fell swoop. I had found my husband at a location that, through plenty of research and investigation, I arrived there, and that was kind of where everything blew up. And so I remember driving home and having these blood-curdling, uncontrollable screams that just emerged. It was like all the pain was like coming out. Um, and, not always is reality collapse painful and, totally crisis oriented. It can kind of come peacefully, but in my case, it was just this big ordeal. And that tends to be a little bit more the case for people who are about to experience it. And so the thing is, we want to go through reality collapse. It is the gateway to healing. And how can you know it's coming? Well, I don't have an answer for that really, but as we process this together, maybe we'll come up with some ideas. The main thing is this, that if you are uh, in the phase called endangerment awareness, which would be the second phase of complex partner trauma, meaning that you have a lot of energy to learn about what is going on behind your back, to discover your partner. If you're in that endangerment awareness phase, then you are learning about your endangerment, but you don't have like the full picture of how severe it may actually be. And so if you're kind of ebbing and flowing back and forth between this is a big deal, this isn't a big deal, then you might not have reached reality collapse yet, but you might be, in position for that to occur. And that would be a good thing. It doesn't feel like a welcome thing, but a good thing when it comes to the healing process that follows.
If somebody is experiencing reality collapse, there's all many of us will think to ourselves, well, what more is there? What more is there? What more is there? Because often those of us who have had this experience over and over again know that there's often more. How does somebody know if they're in a full reality collapse, or is it a reality collapse for the moment for what they have now? Let's just say that that zoom out button is stuck. How do you know that you have fully reached a reality moment for yourself?
Yeah. Well, essentially, reality collapse is characterized by these reflexive calibrating responses. I've mentioned one of them. These are automatic ways that our brain works to seek safety and establish um, normalcy in an area of deep turbulence, emotionally, even physically. So reflexive calibrating is just these different things that happen. One would be retroactive processing. Another one that I talk about a lot is what I call nth degree thinking. This is when partners are thinking forward to the furthest extent what is possible and deciding that it's likely about their partner so that they can preemptively prepare and brace themselves for the worst case scenario. So what I mean is they're thinking ahead that since I can't get a hold of my partner right now, and I've tried 3 times, that means my partner is, full blown at the brothel, right? I mean, the idea is it's not ridiculous to think that way. It's a mechanism of safety seeking, and that's what I call nth degree thinking. That can happen, in the endangerment awareness phase as well. But when it really kicks in, is when we know how serious things are for ourselves and the level of jeopardy that we've been subjected to. is what really informs our ability to think at the nth degree level. So that's an indicator you might be in reality collapse. Another indicator of reality collapse would be the idea of moral injury. Now, this is not my concept. This is something that they use a lot in the military, but it's the idea of looking back over the past and feeling a deep sense of moral self-contempt almost for having participated in things that were harmful, maybe to the self or to others, or just outside of your character and your integrity. And so a lot of partners will feel that way, that as they look back over the past, that the things they participated in, whether that was sexual intimacy with their partner or building a life in a new state or supporting their partner and sacrificing their own career ambitions, um, uh, these are, or even being too forgiving and letting go of things that shouldn't have been swept under the rug. These are examples of moral injury that partners begin to tangle with in reality collapse. Why did I do that? And we find ourselves sometimes in this state of flux, trying to figure out, how much of this is our own fault to some degree, that we're enduring what we're enduring now. So that's one thing some women will experience. There's other forms of reflexive calibrating, but when you have a lot of these types of automatic processes going on, you might be in the reality collapse space.
Well, you had mentioned the word betrayal violence. Can we just touch on that for just a second? That this is the kind of that controversial piece I had sort of talked about. The question that we have for you is, how does this concept manifest in the lives of those who've experienced betrayal violence? So that question remains, but also, can you just touch in on this concept of betrayal violence, just to clarify any misconceptions that there might be behind this phrase that you have accurately coined?
Yeah, sure. So I'd like to respond by first asking you a question, which you can feel free to edit and chop out of your podcast if you'd like, because it's kind of me dropping this in on you. But I'd like to know what you know about betrayal violence. I do talk about it a lot on podcasts, so I have kind of a basic definition, but I'd like to know how you're coming to understand it. Are you willing to share?
Go for it, Jen.
Okay, there is no definition that I could potentially even begin to give you about it. But what I can tell you is yes. Yes, 100% yes. That word, even now, puts a lump in my throat because I feel like that word accurately describes what I have experienced in my relationships. And so the definition for me would be, for me personally, just hearing the word itself is, yes, that's what I've experienced. It's this bloody, grueling, emotional injury that has left me in ICU. I am bruised. Okay. Honestly, what I was about to describe is very not for a podcast, but it's brutal. Like my intestines are like some zombie movie. You know what I mean? Like, it is the violence that I have experienced emotionally, internally, I think is the thing that keeps me in that zoomed in position. And the more I can process that, the more I can zoom out, and the more I can zoom out. So I don't have like a definition for you. All I can say is, yes, that describes
Your
what I've experienced.
I will say that my story is a little bit different, but my idea of betrayal violence is it's that PTSD level of repeated. Jen, you're always saying that trauma isn't what happened to you; it's what happens inside of you as a result. And and then there's that picture of how deep is the mud. You've got a Chihuahua and you've got a Labrador who have been playing in the mud, and the mud's up to the Chihuahua's neck, and it's only up to the little knee joints of the retriever. And so, it just depends on so many variables of how a person, male or female, is going to experience betrayal. It depends on the individual, but for some individuals, for many individuals, the result is as you were talking, Jen, I just had this picture of someone just taking a knife and filleting you open and leaving you exposed to the elements, completely vulnerable, completely unprotected, and completely exposed to damage, for continued damage coming. It's just, yeah, betrayal violence is such a hard, hard two words to put together, hard word to say, and yet such a truth that we want to run from. We don't want to face this reality. And I love what you said earlier, Hope, and that is that I don't think that so many of these individuals intend to have this effect on their loved ones. But regardless, that is the effect. It's a domestic abuse kind of reality and or outcome. So yeah, give us the technical definition that you of the term you coined.
I will provide that definition for you, and thank you for sharing. Um, you both explained so precisely and with good illustrations, graphic ones, right?
Sorry. I
Yeah,
honestly feel like sometimes I'm living in one of those survival movies,
yes.
just trying to outrun those zombies. So,
Yeah, so we
yes.
shouldn't apologize about depicting this for the world the way it truly is, right? That's part of how we gain more advocacy, understanding, and ultimately healing treatment for people. So I love it. They probably weren't graphic enough, but what you were describing is the the victimization, I guess, of betrayal violence. Betrayal violence isn't what the partner experiences. They experience complex partner trauma, or we also refer to that as betrayal trauma. I prefer to use a more precise idea. That's why I talk about it as complex partner trauma. But betrayal violence is the conduct or the behavior of the person who's doing three things. So here's your definition. Ready? Number one, they are maintaining a relationship with a committed partner. That might be their partner, lifelong partner, their spouse. It's a committed relationship. Number two, they are secretly and repeatedly violating fidelity. And number three, they are using deception, persuasion, or gaslighting, and exploitation, which I can explain, to avoid the consequences. So they are enacting deception, gaslighting, and exploitative behavior toward their partner to keep their partner in the dark. By doing this, however, they are governing their partner's reality. They're withholding essential information about their partner's safety and well being. And the detriment that results from that is the complex partner trauma, the filleted open fish, the intestines and the guts. That's the ramifications that people who've been victimized in this way experience that. Now, why do we use the word violence? Why do we use the word victimized? Listen, I'm not trying to be ridiculous. Essentially what this is a extension of what we already know and what's well established in research in the domestic violence field. When power and control is used to reduce agency, consent, and safety, when it creates risk factors and detriment for someone, particularly who's on your peer level or subordinate to you, such as a child or an elderly person or a differently abled adult who's dependent, when power and control manifests in those scenarios, um, and it causes detriment, we have safety concerns. We have abuse, really, a dynamic of abuse, right? And this abuse is intentional in part because every choice that's made to deceive, to exploit, etc., is done as a choice. There's decision power behind all of that. But very often with betrayal violence, what we find is that essentially this is about covering your butt and avoiding consequences, having your cake and eating it too, really, being able to act outside the bounds of fidelity and then not experience the natural ramifications, which in part are the pain of your partner, who you probably still really love. And so it's not noble, but a lot of people feel that they can protect their partners and also avoid the consequences. So when I say it's not intentional in that regard, I'm not letting people off the hook. I'm not minimizing this. I'm just saying that betrayal violence behavior, or that conduct of three parts of being in a relationship, cheating, and then lying about it, that conduct is often a place people find themselves in versus planning for. It is a form of power and control, and thus it's a domination experience that doesn't look the way that intimate partner violence looks. The power and control that we see in those kind of settings may involve physical assault, which betrayal violence does not. Domestic violence within the home, where there's power and control being used to intentionally subdue and demoralize and diminish and dominate a partner, is going to look very different than betrayal violence. Betrayal violence is simply where I saw a need to extend what we know about domestic violence into the realm of infidelity, which sets people up to begin using power and control inappropriately and therefore creating abusive dynamics in their relationship that go unchecked because we're not calling it what we need to call it. And therefore the healing process gets stalemated. It gets delayed because we aren't addressing the power dynamics right away. We're often telling the person who's cheated to go get help for their sexual problem. And then eventually, or maybe right off the bat, we're doing interventions like disclosure and couples work. But if we leave this inequity unaddressed, true trust and safety cannot be rebuilt. And that's what my whole desire is, to see the world understand this so that people get treatment quicker, faster, and so that we can reduce the stigma in society around people who stay in these scenarios.
I have a follow-up question with that. Do you find that, so you had mentioned that sometimes people are intentional with it and sometimes they're not, and there's all these psychological reasons behind why people do what they do. Do you find that people that are in this abusive dynamic, especially with the holding of reality, the withholding of reality from their spouse, I think a lot of women, a lot of people, let me rephrase that, a lot of people that are on the victim side of this betrayal, wonder, first of all, can that person, especially those that really aren't necessarily intentionally doing it, but definitely doing it, can they change? Because if they are in this perpetual power dynamic, obviously for their own psychological reasons, can they really change? What are the signs that someone even wants to change? And then as the spouse or person that's on the receiving end of this, I know I don't want to get too far from where we're going with the podcast today, but this is a really important question. What do you do? Can the person change? And what do you do while you wait for that as the person on the receiving end of that?
Great question.
What does that person do? Because you have to create boundaries and safety and for yourself, but you're still in the relationship. You know what I mean? And how do you move toward that when someone's really got these deeply rooted psychological issues behind these power differentials that they are creating in the relationship? Can someone really change? And what does the other person do while they're waiting for that person to change?
Such a simple question. I have the easiest answer for you. No, I'm kidding. Let me start. Okay. The first question is, can they change? And so this is one major benefit to differentiating the abusive dynamics that occur after infidelity from regular coercive control or intimate partner violence. Because according to domestic violence literature, it's been well established that people who really do want to diminish, demoralize, and dominate their partners, people who intentionally establish power and control to operate as a regime that causes their partner to have less agency, and they're doing this willfully and purposefully because it fulfills whatever desires they have for control, a person like that is hard-pressed for change, and we know that. Problem is, if we see infidelity as just coercive control, then we are not attuning enough to the intention behind it. Now, the intention makes it no less severe, but the intention does matter because these people, if they are not coercive controllers, have built a power and control regime because they started keeping secrets and because they started becoming deceptive and then manipulating truth and their partner and exploiting their partner's labor, trust, loyalty, spiritual convictions, whatever. They started doing this for the very sole purpose of not letting their partner know what's going on behind closed doors. In other words, they started doing this to avoid consequences. There isn't the same mentality behind that version of power and control as there is behind coercive control. However, if a coercive controller is cheating and, exhibiting betrayal violence, then forget betrayal violence. There's other bigger, broader context of abuse and control that need to first be addressed. The cheating just adds layers of pain and anguish for the partner, but it's not the forefront of the focus. But when the inaugural power and control differential has been established by keeping sexual secrets, meaning when that's the first extension of somebody really powering over their partner, then that can be dissolved. It really can. Now, of course, we're not talking about other inequities that, such as sexism and other things that often impact relationships. But in general, with betrayal violence, there is rehabilitation potential. And it starts with, they need to address whatever sexual issues there may or may not be. Sexual health is important to, being able to stay faithful to your partner. But what they need to do is the work that I do in my Getting Dire Straight program. Dire stands for detachment, incongruence, regression, and entitlement. These are the 4 maladaptive character traits that I have found consistently over all the years I've worked with these men in this position that undergird that abusive behavior that they really don't intend to exhibit, but don't even realize they've been doing for years, that have constructed that power differential. And until we attend to Dire, we can't dissolve it very well. So that means no matter how sober he is or how empathic he's learning to be or how much couples therapy and all of that he's doing, until he appropriately and adequately addresses these issues, his wife is going to have a lot of complaints. And I'm using him and her right now because my Dire program is only for men. So, that's kind of the first question. The second question is, what does a partner do? Well, a partner can do whatever the resolve and intuition within her lands on. The problem is most partners feel like they're in a state of flux.
Yes.
They haven't been able to land somewhere. It's such a gray zone for so long. It's extremely complex, hence why I call it complex partner trauma. But I do believe this for partners, as they connect to the intuition that's always been there, but as they make and strengthen that relationship there, that they have to that intuition, when it decides something, when it has enough information to make a decision, whether that's about staying or more so about leaving or filing for divorce or about trying a program or about changing a method they're using or an approach they're using, when it's made a decision because it has enough information to land on that decision, the intuition can be trusted and it will tell you it's made a decision. It won't necessarily be very clear, but it will give you that resounding resolve within that allows you to know what you need to know about what you need to know there. And so that's about the best I can offer.
I love that.
Partners need to be
If you
safe as
you'll
well.
know when you know. So just practice listening to that intuition. Practice your relationship with, that intuition. It is truly baby steps. Yeah, that's good.
Good conversation. Those are some great questions. I love, Hope, you said attuned to the intention. Oof. I feel like that needs to be a sticker on my water bottle. Attuned to the intention. All right, my question for you is you mentioned endangerment. So, what do you mean specifically by endangerment in this context? And what do we need to be aware of regarding our own endangerment? Sarah, I guess that leads back a little bit to the question of, is there any way that we can anticipate the Mack truck? How do we protect ourselves?
Great questions. Um, So, there's many zones of impact that a partner can experience according to their gender, their culture, their age, their life situation, their finances, their spirituality. So, I kind of sort endangerment according to these zones. And, you have your psychological well-being, your cognitive abilities, your physical well-being, your sexual self, your spiritual or existential pieces. But then there's also these domains of finances and legal territory sometimes that people experience impact from. Your relationships with your family, your kids, your friends. So there's just plenty of areas that will experience significant detriment as a result of, betrayal, violence being in the home, and how a person comes to understand all those impacts depends somewhat on how much endangerment awareness they have, meaning how much they've been exposed to the truth, how much discovery they've had or evidence they've found, but also how significant the tango is with their partner who's convincing them otherwise. And so once we cross that threshold of reality collapse, we don't need convincing, or we're less subject to being convinced otherwise, away from our hunch, because our hunch becomes essentially that strong. We don't know necessarily all the details or even all that we need to know, but we have enough sufficient guttural level information to determine how endangered we are. And that means essentially that these different zones of impact have been illuminated to us. I am not physically safe, or I financially need to get a rein on things because this doesn't feel safe. Emotionally, I am unsafe, and it may be, there may be nothing really beyond the emotional and mental health impact zone for some people. But oftentimes there is, in most cases there is. There's physical ramifications that don't necessarily always have to do with being exposed to sexually transmitted infections. Sometimes the physical ramifications are due to stress, due to the volume of difficult conversations and distrust. There's just all these different domains, all these different impact zones. So that's what endangerment is. It's figuring out what detriment you faced within each of the zones and how that all really occurred.
I'm just, as you're talking, I'm thinking, yeah, it hurts when the floor drops out and you land in the basement.
Yeah.
That impact, that impact's rough.
Yeah. I'm wondering for those of us that struggle, okay, let's just say an individual is struggling with feeling safe. Some of us will be in that space where, am I feeling unsafe because I am unsafe? Or am I feeling unsafe because I'm just in trauma? So, and when I say just in trauma, I use the word just. That kind of minimizes trauma, but I don't mean to do that, but for some of us, we might actually be in danger. That gut intuition that I was just saying that we need to learn to trust. But also there's this other piece, like, okay, there's this element of PTSD that you're experiencing. But how do you know which is which? So how does the reality collapse affect our ability to process these experiences? How do we know?
Well, there is a learning curve there. Any of your listeners who want to hear a more thorough answer to this very question, which is so good, they can go to my website and get into my podcast. The episode I did with Meg Martinez Detamonte is all about how to figure out what danger cues are representing real and actual danger versus kind of an automatic response that has you maybe fretting in a more extreme way than the actual threat is presenting. So I'll say this, that there's a learning curve there. Part of the healing process for us as partners is to identify what real safety looks like and feels like. And, you know,
I
how
have
to
full body chills as you say that because we lose that. We lose that reality and what's normal in this.
I think you said it perfectly. There's not much more to say is other than we need to get back to our baseline of well-being. And that's been deeply disturbed because we didn't have the essential information that would inform our risks to our well-being and our safety. We didn't have that information, and so we were living in an unsafe, endangered context, but we were living as if it weren't endangered. We were living as if things were
Yes.
normal, right? Until
Yes.
we start learning about our endangerment, until our awareness starts growing, and that can last sometimes for years until it culminates into that reality collapse.
Yeah. Wow.
I want to ask a side question on that. I'm in my second marriage, and so we have a blended family. And I remember when the kids were little, calling my friends who were still in a, they were not divorced. It's the original family unit, and the kids were the same age. And I would call and say, "This is what's happening. And what do I do? I think I want to do this, but is this normal?" Because your sense of normalcy with that nuclear family is lost when there's a divorce, and now you've got the different dynamics of blending a family. And I think I experienced this in many areas of my life, where you lose that sense of reality and you don't know what normal is anymore. So I think this is one of the reasons why community groups, talking with a therapist or a coach is so important, because we need each other. We need that collective whole to try to find our equilibrium again. My side question though is, so you have these people, the person experiencing the complex PTSD and such, trying to figure out what normal is or what reality is, versus what they thought it was. But then what about the person who has, what about Stockholm syndrome? And there's probably a better way to say this. You probably have a better clinical term for this within these confines of betrayal and sexual addiction. But what about the person who is like just hanging in there and going and trying, to support and to heal and to pursue their own healing, and it's just a long process. Is Stockholm syndrome something along with PTSD as
How are you
well? Does that make
defining?
sense?
It does,
Mm.
absolutely. And this is a conversation I know is very active, especially on social media. How are you defining the idea of Stockholm syndrome? What do you feel that represents?
When we have so much compassion and empathy or understanding for how the person we're experiencing betrayal violence, and we have so much compassion or even curiosity for the other person, that we lose our sense of reality, or what's healthy, what's normal, should we, when we should ourselves, maybe, of how do we move forward in a healthy manner, when can we be too generous. I think this might go into the areas of, and I'm not a therapist, I don't play one on TV, but into the areas of codependency or unhealthy attachment styles, or and our boundaries start getting fuzzy. I know I've been there, with different people, where I keep trying harder and trying harder and trying harder and leaving space, and they just keep showing up. They keep showing me who they are, and yet I keep trying. So does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, and I'm grateful you expanded on that. So I would say this, that there's one assumption, if we approach this idea that partners could be liable to become codependent or have Stockholm syndrome, or essentially be too fawning and too acquiescing at the expense of themselves. In other words, they become a sacrificial lamb and they allow themselves to be trampled. we must identify the assumption that's being made there, and that's that they have the safety to do the opposite of that. So
Ooh.
domestic violence, betrayal violence, any type of abusive dynamic that involves the exertion of power and control over somebody else involves safety issues. And within intimate partner violence, the safety issues and concerns can be lethal. Uh, and in betrayal violence, in a few exceptions, it can also be lethal. For instance, being subjugated to disease or legal issues or criminal issues. That can happen. It has happened to my clients. But it's less likely. In intimate partner violence, though, the safety risks can be everything from death all the way down to having to endure lectures or be shamed and humiliated in front of your children, derided and degraded in front of people that are also then being, witness to abuse and therefore feeling, the abuse themselves. In betrayal violence, there are safety issues that we cannot assume are there. For instance, if a person who's a partner, let's say it's a woman and she's married to a man, and this man, has gotten into some level of healthy behavior. He's not having affairs or even using pornography anymore, doing whatever he was doing. But he's also quite defensive, and he's not really rising to the occasion within himself to be a good partner. He's kind of flopped from being bad to just being basic, and he's faithful now and expects that should be good enough. So he's deeply entitled, etc. Okay.
Sounds apathetic almost.
Yeah, apathetic and frankly, the roots of that are misogyny. Not that he outright thinks he hates people who are women, but more so that there's a differentiation between the value of different genders, right? So a person like that who's a partner married to that man could be very acquiescing and display codependent looking behaviors. Sometimes people refer to this as betrayal blindness. This is a part of Dr. Jennifer Freyd's concept, and in certain cases it makes perfect sense. But we have to remember betrayal trauma theory was developed originally to articulate a context of children who were being abused by their caregivers. It's a different type of dynamic, especially because a power dynamic already exists in that context. But betrayal blindness, when applied to peers who are in a peer level romantic relationship, in my opinion, is a disservice to partners. And the reason is because it assumes safety is there. It assumes she has enough information to know about the level of endangerment she's experiencing. That's the whole thing, is that the violence of this, the violence of that conduct is not giving somebody the essential information they need to be able to live a life that is not just a great life or a happy life or a content life, a life that has its basic consensual rights.
Authentic.
Yeah.
Do you think a woman who needs to, or a spouse that needs to set boundaries and is struggling to do that, is wrestling with some form of safety? Do you think that there's an element of safety that is required to step out of betrayal blindness? I mean, I kind of think you already saad that, but
Yeah.
where do safety and boundaries come into play with each other?
There's probably 600 reasons, maybe 6,000. That's why we need to be non-pathologizing about betrayal violence. We call it conduct. It isn't a disease, and it doesn't imply narcissism or even sex addiction or any of that. It could be any or all of that. It could be significant childhood trauma that leads somebody into betrayal violence conduct. Same with complex partner trauma and why they may have married someone or partnered with someone who would do that in the first place. There's a gazillion reasons. And if somebody is finding themselves experiencing more compassion or a sense of not being able to set boundaries, it could be because there's a major safety concern, and in doing so, they will be penalized for it, right? I can't believe I said penalized. I always say penalized
I feel like that's totally appropriate.
Yeah, it is.
Welcome to the club.
Thank you. I always say penalized with good reason, I suppose. I think we can figure that out. But maybe it's a sign of like maturity or something. The other day I said data instead of data. I thought, what on earth?
That's okay.
Yeah,
They said it in
I
Goonies.
think that's Canadian. I don't know. They
Yeah.
say process instead of process, and I'm like, you know what? I think they're right. I think
But
they're
do they
saying it
say
right, and we're saying
they
it wrong.
penalize though? I don't.
Half of my family is Canadian. They're correct. They're correct. Word Ben, bean, I
Mm,
mean, whatever. But, I'm just gonna
Thanks for
figure
the humor break.
yeah, I'm gonna figure I sound more sophisticated. But to finish the question's answer here, um, it could be a safety concern. It could also be something like in my own case, where when I was married the first time and my resolve, my intuition told me it was done and I needed to go, I struggled so desperately to depart from that attachment because it was another attachment injury I wasn't prepared to go enact for myself. I mean, I had had so many significant attachment wounds throughout my life. Why would I go sign up for another one on my own choosing by filing for divorce? No, I am going to make this work. Does that make sense?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, I feel like we need to have a whole podcast just on that.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
we could.
Because that is such a struggle. That is such a hard reality of not another failure, not another loss, not another person, my person that I don't want to let go. It's got to work. I
Yeah.
got to make this work. Yeah.
And you add faith constructs on top of that,
Yes.
particularly Christianity, or LDS folks who really deeply believe in the restorative power and will of God. And so, are we abandoning the thing that God wants to do here by deciding to detach from it? I mean, there is so many layers to think through. And if we aren't setting boundaries or following through with boundaries or being consistent, it could be for probably 6,000 reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, which ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a 16-part podcast. So that's it's just going to be Jen and Hope and I for the next 5 months. So you know, there's as I'm thinking about this, I'll keep going with a person. I always told our kids, if you invest in you, I'll invest in you. If you don't invest in you, why are you expecting me to do it? So I think the thing for me is I'll keep going with a person if they're pursuing health, if they're trying all the things, if they're trying to figure out all the nuances. This isn't working, so what else is out there that will work? I'll hang in there with someone if they are genuinely seeking that healing and wholeness. And the faith component. This is a Christian podcast. That's huge. That's huge. Because all things are possible with God. But I also know that can be smoke and mirrors too. That can be manipulative. Like, look at, I'm trying. Look at, I'm doing it. Look at, I'm not sitting in my mess. I'm trying to clean it up. There are addicts out there that will say just enough to quiet her voice, to quiet her concern, so that they can protect the thing that is medicating their pain. And so that's where that discernment is so important. And Jen, I love how you refer to your inner voice as her.
I do.
Listen to her. She's smart, right? It's like
Yeah.
she's her own little personality. And so
Yeah, I'll text you and I'll say, I'm so proud of her. This is what she did today.
yes, yeah, she talked to me and I'm proud of me because I listened to her
Yeah.
and she was right. So I think that sense of discernment and that gut feeling that we have in learning to hear our voice again and learning to use our voice is so critically important, because we can have someone that looks like they're pursuing healing and that's actually not authentic. They're actually manipulating. But then there are those people that genuinely don't want to be this way and they genuinely have Mount Everest to climb to get to that healing point, and I'll hang in with that person.
Yeah.
So when we go through a reality collapse, Hope, what steps can we take toward healing and reclaiming our true sense of reality?
Yeah. That's a great question. I'd like to refer back to what you just shared in order to answer that. We'll use it as an example. So, for instance, if you are partnered to someone who is truly working for change, but it's still not satisfying to you, that's the example I'll use to answer your question. But let me just share as well that very often your partner might be doing, well, it is possible, like you said, Chris, that your partner might be totally snowing you and manipulating you and this and that. And if that's the case, after reality collapse, it is really hard to have the rug pulled out from under you like that again. The training ground of hypervigilance that's rooted in trauma from this kind of betrayal, it develops the most acute sense of smell and taste for danger cues in the environment, particularly related to secrets. I'm not saying you can't be lied to. I'm just saying that you're hard pressed to be in the position you were before, and that's good news. So your partner could be totally screwing you over, but in general, if your partner's doing really well in their recovery, but it's not satisfying to you in the relationship, that means something. So in answering your question, Chris, how can someone take care of themselves, heal, and all of this? Sometimes we have to face the tragedy of it all when the tragedy needs some reckoning with. So if the tragedy is that your partner is doing very well in their recovery, there's, maybe they call it sobriety or sexual faithfulness. Maybe there's a lot of spiritual growth. Maybe there's been a lot of deep introspection into the family of origin. There's been a lot of cleaning up of the lifestyle and the family relationships. And maybe there's less enmeshment with the family or whatever the issues that have been dealt with are. But you don't feel like your partner is someone who is essentially making all this hard work worth it for you. That's okay. I'm very serious and staunch about that. That is okay. Your partner might be dealing with certain struggles that relate to areas that require a lot of skill building. It could be related to the way their brain is structured, could be related to the trauma they had, could be related to how busy they are and how much focus and time they're truly giving to some of these things. We can split hairs until there's no more hairs to be split. And once you're at the end point of that minutia, you can say to yourself, maybe I don't need to keep waiting. Now, what I'm not doing is proposing women in this situation should just leave, or men. But I do think that a part of taking care of ourselves is realizing when we have become a sacrificial lamb, meaning that we've just continually waited, sacrificed our own life on this waiting, for our partner to do something. Essentially, like, our okayness, our being okay, is totally hinged on the output of this other person. And if that's happening, that's a place that people can get stuck for years, decades. I have worked with plenty of women who are into their 60s or early 70s, beginning to process through their divorce that they believe they should have done 30 years before, but didn't and couldn't, and here they are now. And the grief that they experience is very challenging, but they are able to get free. It just feels a little late for a lot of them. So I'm not proposing everyone needs to get out now, and I'm not proposing you do even need to get out. I'm proposing that if you're going to really take care of yourself, sometimes there's tragedy that we have to face. And if we don't get out of our own way, anything from our own past or our own relationships that might keep us hanging on to things or trying for things in order to make them not tragic, whether that's a personality trait we have or a trauma, attachment injury that we are fighting against, then we won't necessarily move on from things sometimes that we need to move on from. And that may be the relationship, or it may be a behavior or a thought process within yourself. So ultimately, this is really nebulous, but to heal from all of this, we have to be able to do hard things. That involves holding pain and allowing it to be complex and not necessarily clear and black and white all the time.
That's really hard because when reality hits, and we start to wake up and we've had that zoom out, we can see a little bit more black and white, but yet we still have to hold space for the gray. And that's really difficult.
Yeah.
That's a very difficult thing. You said holding on to make it not tragic.
Yes.
Lots of us do that. We do that. But yet we need to learn to hold the pain at the same time. You keep using the word complex. Holy smokes. There's not much more complex than this. Like we discussed, there's so many other topics. There's these little micro topics that can come off of this entire podcast. But as we wrap this up today, Hope, do you have any words of encouragement that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I hope this will be encouraging. I mean it. I have confidence, even though I don't know the listener who's hearing this right now. You are going to be okay. You hear a lot of healing stories, right? When you listen to podcasts or read books about it. What we don't hear are the people who, never really healed. They don't necessarily write the books or do the podcasts. The marriages that all ended in divorce and things have never improved for either party. We don't hear those books or podcasts, but I'm sure those stories are out there. The truth is that regardless of what you experience in your environment for what's possible for you, just know inside yourself and decide for yourself that you can be okay, regardless of whether or not you see examples in real life about it. And honestly, the hardest work I think for partners is patience, if they're still in the relationship, and then the feeling of the feelings, the grief. It's easy to feel them through a straw of anger. That kind of comes naturally for a lot of people, but there's like a really profound, deep, hurting pain that sometimes we channel into our mothering or our work or our anger. That really just needs to be sat with. And I think that's one of the other hardest parts. So you can do it and focus on those things. It doesn't have to take the rest of your life to heal. This does not have to define you in anything but ultimately a positive way eventually. If you look at most women who've been through betrayal, such as those of us sitting here, the recycling capability we've had on that pain and trauma has, in my opinion, been powerfully worth it. Now, I'm not saying everyone will feel that way, but man, this is a more common story than not, that people return from this in a way that feels stronger and better than maybe it did before.
That is so encouraging. Thank you, Hope. I'm thinking the bionic woman, better, stronger, faster. There are parts of me that definitely feel like that. We don't have to be grateful for the betrayal. Goodness, no. But we can be grateful for what it produced in us, for the effect it has, for the work. It was transformative. Oh my gosh, one of the most painful surgeries I've experienced ever. But I am so grateful for who I am now. So thank you for that. Hope from Hope. I love it. Well, again, thank you for joining us on the podcast. Hope this was a very rich, very hard conversation, but a necessary one. And we're so grateful for the pioneer that you are and for being that brave person to say it like it is and for equipping all of us to move forward because we don't want to stay stuck. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Jen. Thank you for making space to have difficult conversations like this one.
Absolutely. All right, friends, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Betrayal Recovery Transformation. And that's where we want to hang out, ladies. Transformation is possible. We hope you found today's discussion insightful and empowering. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review that helps other people find the help that they deserve. Your support helps us reach more listeners. So until next time, be kind for yourself and don't give up. We'll see you soon. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Betrayal Recovery Transformation Podcast with your hosts, Chris Rocha and Jen Howie. We hope you've been helped and encouraged. If you value the content we shared today, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. This helps others find the show. Need personalized guidance? Please contact Chris or Jen for transformative coaching. This episode has been brought to you by healingwiththehowies.com, watermarkcoach.com, and with the support of Pure Life Alliance Ministries.